I would like to introduce now the first panel. Jörg Dietrich Nackmayr is somebody you will recognize right away. You know him from geostrategy. He's a specialist. He was our first moderator, and he was actually somebody who was actually one of our first explorers in the Arctic. And we have a great panel here that will Mr. Korkish, who's well familiar with the American situation, Mantovani, who speaks a Swiss dialect, brings it to overall geopolitical thinking, and Wolf Lappins, who's going to be the Tonic. We have here now specialists and a generalist. I don't need much. We have the CVs in the back. Nackmayr, would like to ask you to open the panel. We wish you all the best success. I'm very happy that as a center of excellence, we're taking part in this conference. I would like to convey greetings of our Dr. Admiral Bock and by our executive director, Captain Vettes. And we would like to pursue the cooperation between Kiel and Vienna in the discussion of strategic questions, and we would like to jump right in. We have a time limit that we want to stick to. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in challenging times. The end of Western dominance in international relations has been forecast, and the new disagreement between the United States and its allies has come out into the open. The G7 summit, is it a warning sign? Already 1 year ago, the German Federal Merkel said in a campaign speech in München, she showed foresight, quote, "The times when we could completely rely on others are actually behind us, and I can only say that we Europeans must take our own destiny into our own hands." The stress was on really into our own hands. The pace with which security policy tectonics is shifting is truly impressive. The slowness with which European nations are reacting to it is frightening. In 2000, the peace dividend that was stressed once again and again since the German reunification was in the report by the so-called Weizsäcker Commission and was framed into a security policy instructions under the title "A Common Security and the Future of the Bundeswehr," has since then become the text and the basis for German security policy. Among others, quote, "Any realistic security policy has to expect the possibility of a new military threat of the Atlantic Alliance and of Germany. Before the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact was the most probable start of such a threat. Today, the most important successor state of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, has the interest along its lines of its national interests to go for a partnership and cooperation with the West than to go for on a course of confrontation. The West is also interested in a partner, interested in cooperation, and a new threat scenario would actually time to take up. 8 to 10 years is what the experts say, and this would give the time a sufficient warning time, end of quote. Since the 16th of March 2014 and the annexation of the Crimea, everything is totally different now, something that we didn't foresee. Without the 10-year pre-warning time, it happened, and the parameters of European security policy changed overnight. For the German political staff, the Russian reintegration of Crimea is a culture shock. All of a sudden, there is fear of war, military muscle play, and a touch of Cold War have returned to Europe. 100 years after the end of the First World War, people are actually pretty prone for disaster forecasts and calendar parallels. Shocked by the events, Germany is now trying to find the right way how to deal with Russia. Germany seems put on the spot. The politicians and experts in the Baltics and Eastern Europe are less surprised. They had always expected such developments, and therefore, especially the eastern expansion of NATO that was actually criticized in 2008 because of German and French reservations. was actually recognized as a cardinal mistake. The analysis of the Baltics and the Eastern was actually right. They, based on their experience, thought that Russia was actually not going to accept the loss of its territories. They actually read the Russian, they took the Russian leadership by its word, because the West had taken Putin's statements more as a folklore, and the Eastern experts actually took his statements seriously, whether it was his toast on Stalin, the reintroduction of the red flag for the Russian armed forces, or the speeches about the largest political catastrophe in the form of the breakup of the Soviet Union. While we in Germany actually promoted the modernization partnership with Russia, the cooperation in the energy sector, and discovered Russia's markets, the sorrows and concerns of the Eastern European politicians remained. Russian, after getting stronger again, would start to get back the areas that they considered its sphere of interests. Therefore, NATO had actually to be expanded as far east as possible in order to stabilize those areas that neither belonged to the West or East, such as the Ukraine, that was always a border region. NATO and the EU membership, the two sides of the same coins that only together guarantee a stable future in security, peace, and freedom. In one sentence, NATO is for life, EU is for a better life. In the meantime, international treaties are not only terminated by Russia, but also by the United States, our closest ally. The occupation of the Crimea and the annulling of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 on the part of Russia were only the start. China occupation of the islands in the South China Sea and the creation of islands, and the termination from the Iran nuclear deal framework on by the U.S. in 2015 offered the signs of a new times. The American administration said in May 2018, quote, "The world is no global community but an arena," end of quote. An arena where there is tough competition. Nations, companies, and other non-government actors are competing there in order to win advantages. This is the elemental nature of international relations, and we support this. Alliances would be forged in order to guarantee security and prosperity for our nations. The former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command, Admiral Harry Blinkley Harris Jr., summed this up in one sentence: our 27-year-old holiday from history is over. Great power competition is back. It seems as if the rule of the law was being replaced by the right of the stronger. What in the Chinese legal tradition over centuries can be shown that the law follows politics and not that politics is tied to the law is something that is becoming popular in the West again. Not only the law, not the law has the power, but the power has the law. A cultural shock is something that the Europeans have seen. Germany, when sticking to its rule-based and consensus-oriented code, it seems more and more isolated. And a small thought on the side, Germany, that is so much in favor of rules and treaties, will actually not support the 2% target that was agreed in the NATO agreements on defense funding. And this is actually supported by the political parties in Germany that are in favor of progression in their own countries, while NATO actually has a 2% tax in the form of a flat tax. What would actually happen if the defense spending progression is going to go into this debate? And then Germany's part of the defense budget would even be more. And this is something that would have to make us think, because this is something that would contradict what we're doing at home. A further detail in this inconsistent German view of international relations. The great powers are going for heroic ideas such as fight, the rule of the stronger, decision-making by the deployment of force, because they're convinced that only in this way the risks, dangers of an unrealistic view of international relations can be encountered. So a part of the American public is actually celebrating the return to the concept of the power of the stronger as a return to a political reason. The Berlin politologist Hermann Münkler has actually analyzed this thought in several books on war and peace, and has coined the term post-heroic society as a term that is true for Germany, but also for many other post-war societies in Western Europe. Whether, as Münkler also says, the question on the degree of heroism is actually a function of demographic factors is something that I don't only want to mention and don't have the time to discuss it. World history, if to write a world history whose fuel is testosterone and not crude oil remains a challenge for the future. This is something that could actually show some unpleasant truths to our aging Western culture. To these truths, in my opinion, also belongs the ignoring of geopolitical basics after World War II, especially in Germany. This view of national politics was actually something that was ignored geopolitical explanation and put legal and moral arguments into the foreground. The rapprochement in geopolitical thinking in Germany actually coincides with the reunification and the end of the bloc confrontation. At the moment when Germany had to discover its new role in the changed political landscape, also geopolitical questions became interesting. As in Germany, both in science, politics, and military, up into the 90s, no geopolitical thinking schools were promoted. It was actually very difficult for the elite to actually identify with the discussions that were happening on this. But the crisis of the past 28 years and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Euro crisis, the Russian-Ukraine war, the conflict zones in Afghanistan, the Mideast, and in the South China Sea, as well as the Arctic, have also strengthened the interest in Germany in politics. One shouldn't criticize this as harshly as the Berlin politologist Herfried Münkler, who in his book actually Kriegssplitter talks about that we only would have had to look at after 1945 at the world order in order to get an idea that the loss of significance of geopolitical thinking in Germany and in Europa is the result of a special situation, was the result of a special situation, and it's not of progress of civilization. If, for example, US in all these decades were paying attention to make sure that the basics of geopolitical thinking were reflected in their decisions, this is shown by the control of the other coasts in Europe and Asia in the tradition of the geopolitician Alfred Tyermann. On the other hand, geopolitical knowledge in Germany is only being rediscovered very slowly. So one might say also Germany's return turning away from geopolitical considerations was a special way after World War II, but it was only possible because Germany, as a part of the Western Defense Alliance and under the aegis of the US, did not have to deal substantially with security questions. And this was also true for the German Democratic Republic. Geopolitical questions were decided in Washington and Moscow, but certainly not in Bonn. But increasingly, this is something that we understand in Berlin. Geopolitical thinking is actually important to recognize conflicts beforehand. For example, the Ukraine conflict, where a more geopolitical expertise would have helped Europe to predict Russia's reaction. And the annexation of Crimea and of parts of the Ukraine shows the power of geopolitics and what consequences Western ignorance vis-a-vis geopolitical basic rules had in 2018. If the European Union, but especially in Germany, the politicians had been in a position to think geopolitical in the days of the Kiev Maidan, then they wouldn't have made these misjudgments. One should have had known how important the control of Ukraine is for Russians' imperial ambitions. The view, the West, with this view, would have actually had to fight for the Ukraine, or it shouldn't have touched it at all. The remaining of the Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence geopolitically is an indispensable prerequisite for Moscow to achieve imperial dreams. And for this reason, Europe actually should have its own interest to separate Russia and the Ukraine permanently. Only because then we would have a chance that Russia might somehow become a part of Europe and not be seen as a nuisance. The size makes a difference. With over 200 million people, Russia could actually go for imperial intentions once more. With 140 million, this is futile. And so Russia actually remains the gas station of nuclear missiles, and the other way around. The idea that Russia, from a strategic view, is a nightmare for Russia. If a potential enemy might actually cross the Ukraine and the flatlands to reach Russia, this is certainly a nightmare for tank metal. Germans acting in the international relations reminds me of saying by Hegel, quote, if the facts don't correspond with the theory, the worse for the facts. The moral world power Germany will actually see a harsh landing in the front court of reality, and it is not clear whether this will lead to a learning curve and adaptation to reality. I see this consisting self-isolation actually as awareness to be right. This is an assumption that will go with political influence, and this will be noticed later. At the moment, Germany, however, believes in its mission, and this is why it's so important, why it was so important to get a seat on the UN Security Council for Germany. Whether this had an influence on history, I'm skeptical. Past year, we already dealt with the question of the classical geographical topics of geopolitics in the 21st century will retain the same weight as in the previous centuries. The rule of territories and straits, the control of strategic ports and resources will remain, whether they will remain important or whether, on the other hand, the control of the airspace, the cyberspace, and the outer space will replace them. Who is going to win on the geopolitical chessboard? The one with the better position, who is controlling the space, or the party that actually controls the powers such as economy, science, and information? If we look at China's international actions, we see that China seems to be active in both categories. On the one hand, they try with their One Belt, One Road initiative to open up geographical spaces if they're suitable for geopolitical suitability, and on the other hand, all the innovation, cyber IT, and information dominance are something that China is going for. China's project One Belt, One Road follows the tradition of the geopolitician Mackinder, who about 100 years ago was predicting the dominance of sea power by the invention of the railroads. Is One Belt, One Road the Chinese instrument in order to do away with the predominance of the sea power US? On the other hand, the control of flowing forces, and here especially of financial forces, are turning into a geopolitical category. Among insiders, the size of transactions and business relations of the Chinese development and of the Exim Bank of China are an indicator how financial forces are shifting globally in favor of China. Whether geography remains the stage of our world politics, this is something we can discuss. The data flows need hubs, and geopolitics will certainly something that will be taught. In the 21st century, authorities will chain airspace, cyberspace, and the control of all the financial flows and other innovations are new power forces that will become part of geopolitical. I would like to end with a quote of by Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist. This could be very important for us as an instruction manual. Quote, the art of the war teaches us not to hope that the enemy is not coming, but to build on the fact that we are ready to receive him. I'm very happy to open the panel discussion and to actually welcome the first panelist, Wolf Lapins. Thank you, Jörg. Dear colleagues, the topic, narrative, cyber, hybridity, resilience, new phenomena, old wine in new skins, or a mobile army of metaphors. Well, in tubes and not skins, and not in bottles, the modern way. This hypothesis that it's with some of these metaphors is actually new things, old things packaged new. So this is actually something here where I would like to first give you an overview and then talk about the four acronyms, a disclaimer. So I'm talking about this. Metaphors are rhetorical means using images, and they are serving the purpose to understand complex concepts, to reduce complexity, and to convince. In ancient Greece, they were considered poetic embellishments. For Aristotle, they were a sign of talent. By their cognitive linguistic research, the two U.S. scientists, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, already worked on the cognitive processes in the 1980s. They all follow a certain pattern, and they actually started a paradigm chain. About 80% of our cognitive processes are not conscious and are unreflected. The omnipresent metaphors actually creates the reality. In politics, we recognize the language as a vital producer of metaphors. The use of metaphors is ambivalent. They oscillate between promoting insight and ideological temptation to fog up. We know terms such as a political fight, a party on the crusade, a political straight walker. So this means what's the trias as tough as crop steel and as tough as leather. Those are metaphors that are very problematic in Germany. So one could say, like Mao Zedong said, politics is an unbloody war, war is bloody politics. And of course, this brings us to Brazilian. This is not new phenomena, but they are used in an inflationary manner. A culture and actually would show that the context goes hand in hand with European doubts and cluelessness. And this is something that we see in metaphors. The transatlantic heaven seems to be closing, and hell is actually crowded by the manifold conflicts. So what remains of the West? Let's put ourselves into the position of a Russian Kremlin consultant. What phenomenon and metaphors would actually resonate if he was calling out his fears: color revolution, democracy promotion, and Eastern expansion? From a security policy view, the USA are trying to actually prevent the Russian dominance and in their sphere of interest as privileged interest sphere. We see actually the perception of political opening is very different in East and West. In the security dialogue, if we talked about wood, we might say the wood is green. The Russian partner might say the wood is large, or vice versa. I actually believe Russian is behaving on the international stage for some years rather as a 30-year-old visitor of a disco. Let's see what happens, and then we'll act. In its systems theory, the sociologist Nick Luhmann postulated on such phenomena that perceptions are contingent. For democratic systems, it is constitutive to accept ambiguity, uncertainty, and contradictions because they are ambiguity tolerant. Authoritarian societies do not tolerate dualities. One of the most significant language philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, we have this statement, quote, "It seems Hegel always wanted to say that the things that look different are in reality the same, while I actually want to prove that things that look the same are in reality different," end of quote. My thesis at the beginning was that the terms narrative, cyber, hybridity, and resilience are not new terms for new facts, but they are known terms that are now being used to political problems of the present. The use of political narrative since the 1990s has seen a lot of use. It seems that the legitimizing influence of the sense of purpose corresponds with the interpretation authority. The French philosopher of the 20th century, of the postmodern Jean-François Lyotard, actually saw in Immanuel Kant, in his narrative on the freeing of the rational man by enlightenment, in Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the history as a product of eternal reason, and in Karl Marx with his emancipation of the proletariat, the founding fathers of history, effective narratives. But this is two sides of a coin. Made in Russia. No, narratives and disinformation are two sides of a coin, be it social bots and the media in Russia since the downing of MH17 have their own narratives, and this shows effect because 82% of the Russian citizens believe in the Ukraine responsibility of the downing of this plane. Binomial, the analytic of the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, actually, according to him, these narratives fall of die must dismiss, distort, distract, dismay, never confess, never admit, just keep on attacking. We should be aware that narrative and naive are actually only 4 letters apart. And there is interference between the two. In the political narratives, they are often enveloped in myths that have origins way back, the so-called German miracle and also German-American friendship. The term resilience as a psychological ability to actually cope with health and social crises without a significant impairment was actually something that started being used in the 1950s in psychology as a term, ego resilience. Resilience research was then expanded to other disciplines such as the economy, ecology, social sciences, infrastructure research, and to investigate the control of systems in case of interferences. In Switzerland, risk prevention and system resistance led to the basic strategy of the Federal Council to protect critical infrastructure in 2009. 4 years later, Vienna followed with the demand in the working out of an all-state concept, national concept, to enhance the resilience of Austria, and was actually implemented in the recommendations of the Nationalrat. In Germany, in the White Book, for German security policy and the future of the Bundeswehr of 2016, the necessity of resilience was also supported. Hybridity is a term that comes from agriculture and the biology as the resulting mixed form by the mixture of separate systems in plants and animals. As a technical terms, it's now being used in academic disciplines, in social linguistics, Creole Pidgin languages, English, or the language of migrants, in new society, in the technological sciences, social sciences, and cultural sciences. See studies on post-colonialism. What I find worth considering is the statement by the Bielefelder sociologist, and I quote, an interesting research topic of the future will be the relationship of real virtualities and hybridity for our own whole life as a hybrid action context, end of quote, Heinz Habach. Very often, security policy and the hybrid warfare is actually ascribed to the U.S. military scientist and politologist Frank G. Hoffman and dated to the year 2005. But he actually refers with the term hybrid warfare in his thesis, I was just checking this again, to a diploma thesis by U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Bill Nemeth of June 2002 on the hybrid warfare in the Second Chechen War in 1999, and describes it as path-breaking research. So not Hoffman, but Nemeth. Etymologically, the cyber term actually comes from cybernemice, the art of navigation of a ship. In science, the mathematician Norbert Wiener used this term for the first time in 1948 in his book Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. It was published in 1963 under Kybernetik, Regelung und Nachrichtenübertragung in Lebewesen und Maschine. So this is about the relations and the comparability of man and machine. Cyber in the 1970s was the brand name of a large computer firm in the US, Control Data Corporation. Cyberspace as a term debuted in 1982 in the science fiction short story Burning Chrome by William Gibson. Today we talk about 6 conflict types in cyberspace: cyber vandalism, cyber crime, cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, cyber terrorism, and cyber war. At the end, 3 theses. By increasing paradigm change in the international order from multilateralism to multipolarity, and with a focus of unilateral interests, Europe's period is coming to an end where we looked at ourselves. We have to react faster to what is happening, or we have to give up on geopolitics. Second thesis, Western narratives such as transatlantic pact and or European value community that are full of emotions have to actually are losing their attraction more and more. Third, digitalization is actually something that is used for de-dogmatization of geopolitical postulates. The World Wide Web is winning out and becoming more important, and virtual spaces are increasingly being filled. Conflicts of the future will be focused on big data and the resources of the future. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Meine Damen und Herren, angesichts der fortgeschrittenen Zeit versuche ich mich wirklich.
I will try to focus on my core thesis. I'm planning on talking about geopolitics and geostrategy as models that are supposed to explain certain phenomena. And I would like to say that I'm a fundamental skeptic. And this for 5 reasons. First, these theories are not clearly defined. It is not clear how they are delimited from other terms or from each other. There seems to be a consensus in the fact that geopolitics is above geostrategy. Geostrategy is only the military dimension of geopolitics. Thus, its premises are quite questionable because they both assume that growth and expansion of power and power politics in general are advantageous, that geographic and topographic circumstances are immutable, and that action is centrally controlled and is implemented without frictions. But that, of course, isn't the case. Then there's the concept fixed on these concepts are fixed on states and especially superpowers and major world powers, and have the ambition of explaining their action in an integrated fashion. And fourthly, the theories provide schematic and simplistic explanations for highly complex processes, and they see the developments as simple fate. So the geographic location forced people to act in a certain way. Who rules the heartland rules the world, is what Mackinder wrote. But this is completely misplaced and misguided determinism. But this is also an example for my last item of criticism, namely the protagonists of geopolitics have the strong urge to provide advice to politicians, and they represent the so-called realistic school of international relations, which often has served to legitimize imperialism and wars of attack. It is because of these weaknesses that geopolitics and geostrategy have long been discredited. But there's now a renaissance, and I can explain it as follows. First, the rise of China, and this rise of China makes the fight for resources were stronger, especially in the third world, and this requires the creation of transport routes and the control over territory. And there's more global trade in general that requires an unfettered use of certain, well, geographical places such as maritime straits. And then there's also climate change and environmental disasters that lead to a greater awareness that man, in spite of his technological progress, is still not master of nature. And thirdly, we're also seeing a renationalization of global policies. So there is not really a dissolution of nation states in supranational structures or major corporations taking power. And this end of bipolarity has led to many unfrozen conflicts, and there are also failed states, and the major superpowers are now interfering in those failed states and unfrozen conflicts increasingly. Now, as to this problem of delimitations, we also need to talk about the concept of strategy. We heard about ends, ways, means. This is a useful approach in order to foster understanding. But let me state that human action has always been dominated by a relation to space and time. So whatever people do, it's in time and space, and this is why I don't understand why we focus on geopolitics and geostrategy. Because geopolitics can be defined as a sum of the ends or goals that a nation or its political elites pursue in the long term, especially in foreign and security policies. Now, geostrategy would be the military component of geopolitics, and in particular the task of a geopolitical actor to coordinate their military forces in some deployment areas or operative theaters. I would like to apply this to two concrete examples and ask, what is the role of geosciences? That's the fourth concept of our panel. I believe that, well, I'm talking about Russia and Switzerland. Now, first I would like to say that it is important to state that we should assume that the actors take effective action and not what they are declaring or intending to do. And we should also differentiate according to individual operative theaters. So let's take Russia and its actions in Syria, eastern Ukraine, and in the West. So in Syria, Russia is pursuing a number of objectives. So they want to be recognized by the US at eye level. They want to weaken the cohesion of NATO, want to help reshape the region, and want to stabilize the Assad regime and to maybe have access to, well, politics, military, and the economy there. But there's also the Islamist threat. They maybe build up the capabilities of their own armed forces and to show how strong their military is, also in view of exports. So the central means to do that is the projection of military power, so geostrategy. Even if Russian diplomacy supports these objectives, of course. In eastern Ukraine, however, the Russian objective that is in the foreground is to prevent Ukraine being part of the West. And this is done with so-called hybrid war. Hybrid warfare that uses a bundle of all kinds of means. It uses military power in a titrated way, and it just uses militias, irregular militias. Well, toward the West, the Russian geopolitics is different. Again, so the military component is reduced to a repeating threat, but in the foreground there are operations of all kinds to influence political decision makers and processes. This is done by manipulating information in mostly the virtual space. So the behavior of Russia in these three countries, can we derive overarching geopolitics as if the sum total of the area of where these regional geopolicies overlap? So the Russian sphere of influence is to be restituted in the sense of a cordon sanitaire by dividing the societies of the target countries, and thus to again reach the status of being a superpower, also endowed with a certain soft power. So these are classical objectives of geopolitics: weakening the opponent and territorial expansion. Modern geoscience, or their insights, however, cannot be considered as a driver of Russian geopolitics. The same goes for economic interests, because if you were to do full cost accounting, these Russian geopolitics would be a fiasco. Now, if you ask about geopolitics and the geostrategy of Switzerland, it is clear that the prerequisites are completely different. Switzerland is much smaller than Russia. Its political power is diffused between government, people, and the parliament. So it is the political power is completely diffused. And for Switzerland, well, they want to project visible power to the outside. But it would be absurd to believe that this could work. So it is not surprising that geopolitics and geostrategy are completely avoided in connection with Switzerland. So I once published an article. That's the only one that ever talked about geopolitics in connection with Switzerland. So we did not consider, of course, military means, because the Swiss army, if they are ever abroad, this is not to project power, but for domestic and foreign policy reasons. Geopolitics, however, well, we are engaged in geopolitics, not in the traditional sense of the term, but of an economic and financial nature, an export-oriented country. And in many respects, we have a globally leading industry and services sector, and thus Switzerland depends on global value chains that require political and legal stability. So Swiss geopolitics is primarily about getting access to markets and raw materials and virtual spaces. That's my thesis, shortly put. Switzerland is diametrically opposed to Russia, and it's very different from Russia, also in terms of geosciences. Russia might benefit from climate change because Siberia can be used for agriculture and the Northeast Passage becomes navigable, but Switzerland is only negatively affected by these phenomena. The glaciers are going to be melting, there will be an extinction of species, and dangerous species will spread. Now, my summary and conclusions, and now I'll be very brief. Geopolitics and geostrategy are concepts that we can completely do without. A grand strategy or strategy would be sufficient, and certain insights of geosciences do have an influence, but that depends, of course, on the actor concerned. This can go from zero to a very large influence. And thirdly, well, the benefit of geopolitical analysis consists in its interdisciplinary nature. Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is already quite late, so we need to be strategically very skillful in order to bring this to a point. I would like to introduce one single idea that I found interesting in the framework of our panel. If you want to secure peace, you need to prepare for the wars. Vis pacem para bellum.
So this theory actually shows that the successful preparation of war requires a cognitive hermeneutic endeavor. Si tu veux la paix, il faut comprendre la guerre. So if you want the peace, then you must actually understand the war in its complexity. The polymological concept actually requires that all conflicts, analog to the political philosophy of Plato, is reflected in three dimensions: the economic dimension, economy, fiscal economy, resources, infrastructure, technology, and demography come in here. Second dimension, the political dimension, geopolitics, geostrategy, reason of state, power projections, and diplomacy. And third, the cultural dimension, religion, language, culture, education, values. So each conflict should be broken down with these three-dimension mind to see what is really here, the dimensions. This polymological structure in view of a conflict actually does not mean that you record all relevant dimensions, but without this scheme and approach, it is you cannot really understand the nature of the conflict, and you cannot really develop a strategy. A central problem in the polymological conception is the fact that the political dimension, geopolitics, and here is actually has seen a multiple paradigm change in the 20th century from the hot World Wars I and II that sacrificed millions of people via the Cold War with its proxy victims until the outbreak of hot peace after 1991 that we have actually now seen in recent years a peace that's still a peace, but it is actually turning into a cold peace. Beyond the classical war and conflict constellations, we have also seen in the past 25 years structural threat scenarios that have concrete effects, but not always perceived as such, perceived by the political public, because this was mentioned already today. This is something we see not only in Germany. These threats cannot always be considered political. See Carl Schmitt and his friend enemy dialectics, but we could get used to the fact that these classical markers are no longer found in the present. So the discussion in the civil society is defense, what for? We don't have any enemies. If there is no enemy, we don't need defense, is the logical conclusion. Although these current threats are actually manifold and serious, it is polymologically required to give up the image of the duel of two knights and replace it by a more complex picture. In place of the warlike threat, we have the geotectonic threat. But what does this mean? Geotectonics is replacing classical ideas of geopolitics, that as politics actually always follows the premises of friend-enemy formulas. But in the modern world, Europe, for example, there is no classical, clearly identified enemy, and nobody appears on the scene as such, and one cannot therefore react to it. This was different during the two World Wars and during the Cold War. Now, the fact that there is no classical enemy actually makes Europe expect that we and our liberal democratic way of life are safe, but because there is no enemy anywhere. But this is not the case. Threat, according to Clausewitz, has changed its way, but not its actual nature. In order to give a strong metaphor to this, we should actually talk about geotectonics and not geopolitics. The effects connected to this that may assume threat, very big dimensions of threat, are actually one that they can actually be observed without a targeted enemy approach, can be very strong in its fact. And two, they are extremely compelling, but there is nothing enemy-like and immoral in it. but it is a threat, nevertheless. So it would be the current challenge of spiritual defense in the framework of the Article 9a of the Austrian law here, that not as the time in the Cold War to actually maintain the defense willingness of population vis-a-vis a conventional enemy, but actually to clarify the question before, which is that the necessity has to be proven that we have to defend ourselves if we want to maintain our cultural civilization. Only if this conviction does exist, then we can talk about in a meaningful way about how we can actually develop strategies and counter this threat. The fact that in Europe these security strategies lack this, it's not due so much to a chronic strategy inability and a lack, but more to the lack of conviction that it's necessary to act strategically in the security field. And where I don't recognize the necessity, I will try not to develop competences that are required. It would make sense, therefore, to actually attack the strategy problem at its root. And that would be the task of a new concept of spiritual national defense. Thank you. I would like to ask on behalf of my panel to be given another 5 minutes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have a concept, just some keywords. I'm the gut feeler. I'm the last one here, so I have the right to say anything I like. I can promise you, you won't fall asleep. There's a lot of things that are probably new to you. So I'm not going to quote Mehen, who's already been referred to today. I'd like to just point to something what he wrote in 1890 in his book about sea power, a concept that made sure that the opposite coasts need to be dominated, and thus the lines of communication on the American seas, the Pacific and the Atlantic, that is, would make sure that the Eurasian continent be controlled, the heartland, as he referred to it. But back then the concept didn't exist, of course. So that was the idea 8 years prior to the Spanish-American War, and there was a long time before 1914 or 1917. Now that we're talking about 1914, and let me point you to the fact that the America First, this highly criticized concept, was coined by Woodrow Wilson in 1914. Back then, he wanted to he wanted to state that America is now a global power. The white fleet sailed around the world in 2 years without an accident, so the US now saw themselves as a maritime power, and they were now on the map of maritime powers. Make America strong again, or make America great again. So this can be found in speeches given by several American presidents, such as Ronald Reagan during an electoral speech in 1980. So as you can see, the ghostwriters who wrote the speeches for Trump, well, they looked at the large treasure chest of history, and they found a lot. So sometimes these are very emotional appeals. There was an admonitory speech in Warsaw, the White House messages and speeches, is where you can read up on that. So about 15 American presidents, politicians, and others were quoted with a reference to the fact that actually we're on the way down. So there is a decline, and the Western world is going to go down unless we start doing something now. So Frank Greyfeld, about 10 days ago, held a similar speech, a very emotional speech, but it was in the same vein. So the reason I'm saying it is because even in the USA, and I live in California, we are seeing how quickly the political landscape may change. Many of you still experience the euphoria with Obama. Me too. I made a donation even to his campaign. And today, President Trump is trying to portray Obama as an accident of history. And he's trying to do everything in order to reduce the impact of his role, of Obama's role, because all the decisions that he ever took, with the exception of the National Health Plan, well, this is happening at the level of the individual states. But anyway, he's trying to eliminate everything that Obama did. So don't forget that everything that Trump did in the past, or everything that he announced and promised in his election campaign was implemented. So with the exception of the wall with Mexico, well, he realized everything that he promised during his campaign. And of course, the European gazettes don't like that. Still, let me remind you that Europe has moved farther away from the US than the US has moved away from Europe. Let me give you a little example. The NATO states and the European states, well, the US have bilateral agreements with them. So these bilateral agreements have been concluded for long periods of time, and it was therefore something normal for the US to, well, talk to European countries at the level of these bilateral agreements and to make corrections or additions. Now, the European Union, with the creation of the Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, tried to install an intermediate level, but she is not recognized as an interlocutor. So Mogherini, she comes from the Communist Party of Italy originally, so she was not accepted as a partner. Now, you can imagine that with this ballast, with this burden, it is difficult for Mogherini to well, push through European interests, because for the US there are no European interests. If you take the climate agreement, or the Paris Agreement that the Americans left, so there were about 50 people demonstrating in front of the White House when the US got out of Paris, the Paris Agreement. Nobody cares there. And the Americans are not interested in this excellent Foreign Minister Hillary Clinton always referring to her achievements as a, well, Secretary of State. Foreign policy, well, this is something that is discussed in Washington and New York, but nowhere else. And Trump never argued or never talked about what Hillary Clinton talked about. He talked about unfair trade practices and jobs and attacks against international organizations. Back then, not as clearly as he's doing it now. But anyway, what he's saying is that Bill Clinton made the mistake that he opened the American market to Chinese products without asking anything in return. So there's a whole number of mistakes that were made back then, and Obama's excessive internationalism and institutionalism was never well received among the Republican Party members. The so-called Iran Agreement, not a treaty, just an agreement, no more than that John Kerry concluded in Vienna. Well, in the US, it was maybe reported in the Washington Post or New York Times, but nowhere else. It didn't really cause a lot of hullabaloo. So there was major resistance against this agreement in both parties. Most American newspapers were up in polemics against this, and 110 admirals and generals pointed to the risks inherent in this agreement, and Ashton Carter, the defense minister in the Obama administration, recently wrote in an article in the Washington Times that this agreement, not a treaty, this agreement would expire in 2024. And what then? Iran has missiles that have a long range, and they could get nuclear weapons from Pakistan any time. And if that were to happen, then Turkey, Egypt, and maybe other countries in the region are going to say, what? They have nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. We feel threatened by Iran. And that would lead to the problem of this conflict that is now between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is still, well, only happening in Yemen so far, but it may take on a bigger, greater dimension, because a missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers and a 200 kiloton warhead is not without risk for Europe. It is for that reason that I see the coming elections with a lot of interest. Obama hasn't done anything wrong so far, so you should not see this from the perspective of a European radio commentator or from the ZDF or from a daily newspaper that gets their information in turn from TV commentators that are towing the line of whatever mass medium they work for. No, please listen to other voices too. And then the picture is going to shift somewhat. So we will see how the midterm elections will turn out. In California, there is a quarrel among the Democratic Party, and maybe in California the Republicans might win a few more delegates in the House of Representatives, and this might compensate for losses in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio. So the problem I'm seeing is that what's going to happen if this current boom with 4.5% economic growth and full employment, if this boom were to stop, then every president will be faced with difficulties. Now, the major merit of Obama had been that the crisis, when it started, well, he readily identified the crisis, and as opposed to Bush and his advisors back then, and Jonas McCain, who never used the word crisis or recession because he said by November it'll be all over. So that the mistakes have been corrected, but it took a year and a half for the entire Federal Reserve Bank and the Treasury Department and the other institutions and universities well managed to change the course, also with Ben Bernanke and others. So that was a major achievement of the Obama administration. On a foreign policy level, the first briefings of CIA in January of 2017 were bad. CIA just pointed to the fact that where US lost in influence, and Trump's answer to that was, well, he made hundreds of phone calls and a large number of trips abroad, like hardly any president before him. So these lost geopolitical and geostrategic spaces should be, well, won back, because since 1945, what the US want is to preserve their influence in the world. And if the World Trade Organization or GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or whatever other organization, be it the UN or any other, or the Human Rights Group, if they keep on their polemics against the US and turn a blind eye to their own failings, then the US are going to say, well, we're going to leave them. We're going to leave these organizations. Or like children are separated from their parents. Well, this law comes from the Obama administration. It was just exacerbated. Dianne Feinstein, the senator of California, who believed in good faith that the children who are crossing the borders are the children of those people, whether it's actually the mothers and fathers or whether they're just brought along. And 10,000 children in Texas, mostly, well, it wasn't possible to find the parents for these children. And then they took the microphone to these crying children and to say that, well, it is Trump's fault that the children are separated from their parents. But no, it dates back to the Obama administration, this law. And that was actually admitted a few days ago on television. But in Europe, nobody is seeing that. This isn't discussed in Europe. What they repeat here time and again is Obama separates the poor kids from their mothers. Trump, not Obama, yeah. Trump is separating those poor children from their mothers. All right, so the problem cannot be solved. It's probably going to take a while. So every day, 60 to 80 of these children still manage by some circuitous paths to make it to the US. Sometimes they come through Canada. So now there are also roadblocks in Maine, North Dakota, etc., even in Wisconsin, in order to find out who's coming into the country. So there are people coming in from Iran, Bangladesh, from Pakistan, and the ones who come to Canada, well, how they come to Canada, nobody can say. And all of a sudden they're on American soil. They're not asylum seekers. There are, in fact, well, economic migrants. And thus they have illegally entered the US and are thus, well, to be deported. And Geo Johnson said recently, in the Obama administration, in the past 4 years, we, well, deported more than 1 million people. So quite a lot of people who had illegally entered the country and who were deported. So a rather complicated and very extensive process, by the way. So that was my gap filler, more or less. Thank you. Okay, now we'll have a coffee break. Short announcement, an organizational comment. I would like to thank you for the excellent presentation. It's a pleasure listening to what Mr. Lapine said, and also we got the American perspective coming from the soul of the American people. So it's brilliant. Apologize, we don't have the time to discuss this fully, but I didn't want to simply cut off. I believe that what has been presented here was really such a plethora. I didn't want to intervene. We do have a time problem. So I could postpone the coffee break. We lost 10 minutes, so maybe we can afford to cut the coffee break by 5 minutes. Well, in that case, if that is possible, then please end the coffee break at 3:25, and then General Hofbauer will be with us. Thank you.